The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, a town that seemed to have sprouted from the very earth it sat upon, harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. Wind-blown tumbleweeds rolled past the weathered boardwalks, and the air carried the familiar scents of leather, horse sweat, and the ever-present dust that settled on everything like a second skin. The town consisted of little more than a saloon with its bat-wing doors creaking in the breeze, a small chapel whose whitewash had long since surrendered to the elements, and a general store that served as the lifeblood of the scattered ranches dotting the surrounding plains. Jacob Sullivan guided his bay mare down the rutted street, the leather of his saddle creaking with each step. At 28, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs, his face bronzed by the sun and etched with fine lines from squinting across endless prairies. He'd come to town for supplies, salt for preserving meat, grain for his horses, and perhaps a few luxuries like coffee and sugar if his meager profits allowed. The cattle business had been hard lately, with drought thinning the grass and making every head of livestock a precious commodity. As he approached the general store, something caught his eye in the town square, a sight so unexpected that he pulled up short, his mare snorting softly at the sudden stop. There, chained to the stone pillar that served as the town's informal center of justice, was a woman. Her head hung low, dark hair falling in tangled waves that obscured her face. Her dress, once perhaps a respectable navy blue, was now torn and dusty, the hem ragged from dragging in the dirt. But it was the wooden sign hanging around her neck that made Jacob's stomach turn. Crude letters spelled out "Take her," as if she were nothing more than unwanted livestock at auction. A small crowd had gathered, their voices carrying across the square in a mixture of crude laughter and callous commentary. Men in worn denims and dusty hats stood with thumbs hooked in their belts, some spitting tobacco juice into the dirt as they appraised the woman like she was horseflesh. Women in calico dresses hurried past with averted eyes, clutching their market baskets tighter, as if misfortune itself might be contagious. "Ain't nobody fool enough to take on that burden," drawled a voice Jacob recognized as belonging to Tom Garrett, the blacksmith. "Woman's got the stink of bad luck all over her. Her husband died owing half the town money," added another man, his voice thick with the self-righteousness of those who mistake fortune for virtue. "Left her with nothing but debts and shame. Town council figured this was the most merciful way. Let someone else deal with the problem." Jacob dismounted slowly, wrapping his mare's reins around the hitching post with deliberate care while his mind raced. He'd seen cruelty before. The frontier had no shortage of it. But something about this particular scene struck him deeply. Perhaps it was the way the woman's shoulders shook slightly, though she made no sound. Or perhaps it was the way the morning light caught on what could only be tears tracking down her partially visible cheek. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the packed earth. Now he could see more clearly. The chain around her waist was rusted but solid, locked with a padlock that spoke of permanence. Her wrists bore the telltale marks of rough handling, angry red welts that stood out against her pale skin. When she sensed his approach, she lifted her head slightly, and their eyes met. Those eyes, Lord help him, those eyes nearly undid him. They were the color of prairie grass after rain, green with flecks of gold. But it was the expression in them that stopped him cold. He'd expected to see defeat, perhaps even madness, but instead he saw a fierce dignity fighting against despair, a soul that refused to be entirely broken despite the circumstances. Tears had carved clean tracks through the dust on her face, and even as he watched, another rolled down her cheek. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst or crying or both. "Please, just walk away. Don't make sport of me like the others." The words hit him like a physical blow. She thought he'd come to mock her, to add his voice to the chorus of derision. Without thinking, Jacob found himself kneeling before her, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with fine bones that spoke of a genteel upbringing somewhere far from this rough town. "What's your name?" he asked softly. ignoring the murmur of surprise from the crowd at his gentle tone. She blinked, as if the simple question was unexpected. "Elizabeth," she managed. "Elizabeth Morrison, though I suppose that name means nothing now." "Everyone's name means something," Jacob replied. He stood and turned to face the crowd, his jaw set. "Who has the key?" The crowd shifted uneasily. It was one thing to stand around gawking and making cruel jokes. It was another entirely when someone actually showed interest in claiming what the sign offered. Finally, Mayor Josiah Pickens stepped forward, his ample belly straining against his brocade vest, a vanity that looked absurd in this rough town. "Now, Sullivan," the mayor began, his tone patronizing. "You don't want to be taking on this kind of trouble. Woman's cursed, sure as sunrise. Her husband died in that mine collapse last winter, left debts to near every merchant in town. We're doing her a kindness, giving her a chance at a new situation instead of sending her to the workhouse." "A kindness," Jacob repeated flatly. "Chaining a woman like an animal and putting her on display, that's your idea of kindness. Better than letting her starve," someone called out. "Or worse." Jacob's hand moved to rest on the handle of his Colt, not drawing it, just letting it rest there, a reminder that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. "The key," he said again. Mayor Pickens produced it reluctantly, holding it out like he was offering Jacob a live rattlesnake. "On your own head be it, Sullivan. Don't come crying to the town when she brings ruin to your doorstep." Jacob took the key and turned back to Elizabeth. Her eyes had gone wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to unlock these chains now. You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, but I'm offering you a place at my ranch. It ain't much, but it's honest work and a roof over your head." "Why?" The word was barely a breath. "Why would you?" "Because I've got eyes in my head and a conscience that still works," Jacob replied gruffly. The lock clicked open, and the chains fell away with a clatter that seemed to echo across the square. Elizabeth swayed on her feet, and he caught her elbow to steady her. She flinched at first, then seemed to realize his touch was meant to help, not harm. Jacob shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool dwarfing her slight frame. The crowd had gone quiet now, the mockery replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Some looked ashamed, though others maintained their hard expressions, convinced that Jacob Sullivan had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Can you ride?" he asked Elizabeth. She nodded, though he could see the effort it took just to remain standing. Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his mare, then swung up behind her. She tensed at the necessity of his arms around her to hold the reins, but exhaustion soon won out over propriety. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Jacob heard the whispers starting up again behind them, predictions of doom, speculation about his motives, crude suggestions about what he intended to do with the woman. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the road ahead and the slight weight of the woman who leaned against his chest, her body shaking with what he realized were silent sobs. "It's all right," he found himself saying, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "You're safe now." She didn't answer, but one small hand came up to clutch at his coat, now hers, and in that gesture, he sensed both gratitude and a terror that safety was just another illusion in this hard land. As Cedar Ridge fell away behind them and the vast expanse of prairie opened up ahead, Jacob Sullivan wondered what exactly he'd just gotten himself into. But when he remembered those tears on her face and the dignity in her eyes even as she knelt in chains, he knew he couldn't have ridden away. Some things a man just couldn't let stand, not if he wanted to be able to look at himself in the shaving mirror come morning. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the endless grassland, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, wild and free, the way no person should ever be chained. The town square had filled with more onlookers as word spread of the spectacle. Elizabeth Morrison knelt in her chains, trying to shrink into herself as the crowd grew. She'd been there since dawn, When Sheriff Harlan and 2 deputies had dragged her from the boarding house where she'd been staying, if you could call sleeping on a moldy straw mattress in exchange for scrubbing floors, staying. Look at her, putting on airs like she's still a lady, sneered Mrs. Prudence Weatherby, the banker's wife, her voice carrying clearly across the square. As if we don't all know what kind of woman lets her husband die in debt. Elizabeth bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. She'd learned over the past months that defending herself only made things worse. The truth, that her husband Samuel had hidden his gambling debts until the day he died, that she'd known nothing of the money he'd borrowed against their small homestead, didn't matter to these people. In their eyes, a wife was responsible for her husband's sins. "Heard tell she's from back east," said another voice. "Younger, male, Philadelphia, maybe. Come out here thinking the frontier would be some grand adventure. Well, she's getting a taste of frontier justice now," someone else added with a harsh laugh. A group of rough-looking men had gathered near the saloon, passing a bottle between them despite the early hour. One, a thick-set fellow with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, sauntered closer. Elizabeth recognized him as Walt Dixon, one of her late husband's creditors. "Maybe I'll take her after all," Dixon mused loudly. His words slurred. "Could work off what her husband owed me. Course, might take a real long time, the way I calculate interest." The implications in his tone made Elizabeth's skin crawl. She pressed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear, to wake from this nightmare. But the bite of the chains and the ache in her knees where they pressed against the hard-packed earth kept dragging her back to cruel reality. "Now, Dixon," Mayor Pickens interjected with false joviality. "Let's keep this civilized. The woman needs a respectable situation, not respectable." Dixon spat into the dust. "Since when has Cedar Ridge cared about respectable? We all know why you really put her up here. Pickens. Nobody wants the expense of keeping her. But nobody wants to be the one to turn her out to starve neither. So you figure let someone else take the burden, or let her rot in the sun until the problem solves itself." Elizabeth heard footsteps approaching and tensed, but these were different, measured, purposeful, not the swagger of men looking to intimidate. She raised her head slightly to see a tall man in worn but clean range clothes studying the scene with an expression of barely contained disgust. When their eyes met, something shifted in his weathered face. "Please," she heard herself whisper, the word scraping past her dry throat. "Please, just walk away. Don't make sport of me like the others." But he didn't walk away. Instead, he knelt before her, and the simple courtesy of meeting her at eye level nearly broke what little composure she had left. When he asked her name, not what she'd done or why she was there, but simply her name, she could barely process the humanity of it. The conversation that followed passed in a blur. She was vaguely aware of tension in the crowd, the shift in atmosphere when Jacob Sullivan made his intentions clear. Mayor Pickens' reluctance to produce the key spoke volumes about the town's true motives. They'd wanted her gone, but hadn't wanted the responsibility of directly casting her out. This public humiliation was their cowardly solution. "Don't come crying to the town when she brings ruin to your doorstep," the mayor warned as he handed over the key. Elizabeth wanted to protest, to warn this stranger that the mayor might be right, that everyone who'd shown her kindness since Samuel's death had somehow suffered for it. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house had lost customers after taking her in. The Methodist minister who'd spoken up for her had found his congregation mysteriously shrinking, but her voice seemed to have fled entirely. The click of the lock opening sounded impossibly loud. The chains fell away, and with them went the last of her strength. She swayed dangerously, and Sullivan's hand on her elbow was all that kept her upright. The touch was gentle but firm, so different from the rough handling she'd endured that morning. When he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, the warmth and weight of it nearly undid her. It smelled of leather and wood smoke and honest work, scents that reminded her of better times, before Samuel's promises had lured her from her family's modest but respectable home in Baltimore. Behind them, the crowd's whispers turned uglier. "Fool's going to regret this," someone muttered. "Mark my words, inside a month he'll be back here trying to get rid of her. Maybe he's got other uses for her," Dixon called out crudely. "Pretty enough, under all that dirt." Sullivan's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the insult. Instead, he lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then mounted behind her. The necessity of his arms around her to manage the reins should have frightened her. Months of rough treatment had taught her to fear men's hands. But something about his careful touch, the way he held himself slightly apart even while supporting her, spoke of a decency she'd almost forgotten existed. As they rode out of town, Elizabeth couldn't stop the tears that came. They'd held her up on display for hours, stripped her of dignity and hope, reduced her to something less than human. And now this stranger was taking her away, to what fate she didn't know. The coat around her shoulders was warm, but she couldn't stop shaking. "It's all right," Sullivan said quietly. "You're safe now." Safe. The word seemed foreign after so many months of increasing desperation. Safe from what? From chains and public humiliation. Perhaps. But what came next? She'd learned that kindness often came with a price, that men who seemed decent in daylight could become monsters behind closed doors. Yet something in his voice, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait, and the vast openness of the prairie spreading before them began to calm her racing heart. She was leaving Cedar Ridge behind, leaving the whispers and the judgment and the cruel faces of those who'd rather chain a widow than help her. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she'd endured. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, my mother died when I was 12. Consumption. My father, he didn't handle it well. Took to drinking. Lost our farm back in Missouri. I remember how folks looked at us after, like poverty was catching, like our misfortune was somehow our fault. Remember how they'd cross the street rather than help?" His voice was matter-of-fact, but she heard the old pain beneath it. "I swore if I ever had the chance to do different, I would." Elizabeth closed her eyes, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. Not from despair this time, but from something more complex. Grief for the young boy he'd been, gratitude for the man he'd become, and perhaps the faintest stirring of something she'd thought dead. Hope. The sun climbed higher as they rode, the town shrinking behind them until it was just another smudge on the horizon. Elizabeth found herself leaning back slightly against Sullivan's solid presence, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. She didn't know what awaited her at his ranch, didn't know if she could trust this unexpected kindness. But for now, for this moment, she was no longer kneeling in chains while the world made sport of her suffering. The prairie wind dried the tears on her face as they rode toward an uncertain future, but one that had to be better than the past she was leaving behind. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing, their shapes dark against the golden grass. Somewhere out there was a new life, a new chance. She clutched Sullivan's coat tighter around her shoulders and allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe in the possibility of redemption. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, a sea of brown and gold grass rippling in the warm wind. Scattered clusters of prickly pear cactus dotted the landscape, their paddle-shaped segments bearing yellow blooms that seemed impossibly cheerful against the harsh terrain. In the distance, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in afternoon haze. Jacob guided his mare along a barely visible trail that wound between stands of mesquite and occasional cottonwoods, marking the presence of water. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours in relative silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Elizabeth had stopped trembling, though she remained tense against him, as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Jacob didn't blame her. Trust was a luxury folks in hard circumstances couldn't afford. "Ranch is just over that rise," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "It ain't much, but it's honest." She nodded slightly but didn't speak. He could feel her wariness like a physical thing, the way a spooked horse holds itself ready to run. "Well," He knew something about gentling scared creatures. Patience was key, and letting them come to you in their own time. As they crested the hill, his spread came into view, a modest affair by Texas standards. But it was his, won through years of back-breaking work and careful saving. The main house was built of rough-hewn logs, solid and weatherproof, if not fancy. A barn stood off to one side, its door hanging slightly crooked, something he'd been meaning to fix. Beyond that, a corral held a few horses, and in the distance, his small herd of longhorns grazed peacefully. "Welcome to the Double S Ranch," he said, trying to inject some warmth into his voice. "Not the biggest operation in the territory, but we get by." Elizabeth finally stirred, lifting her head to take in the scene. "It's peaceful," she said softly, and he heard genuine appreciation in her voice. "That it is." Jacob agreed. "Nearest neighbor is 5 miles east. Town's a half-day's ride. Man can think out here without the world crowding in on him." He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. She hesitated before accepting his hands at her waist, and he made sure to release her the moment her feet touched ground. She swayed slightly, and he could see the exhaustion written in every line of her body. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She looked away. "Yesterday morning, maybe the day before. It runs together." Jacob felt anger kindle in his chest, not at her, but at the good citizens of Cedar Ridge who'd let a woman starve while they debated what to do with her. He kept his voice gentle, though. "Come on inside. I'll fix something up." The interior of the cabin was Spartan but clean, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end. A ladder led to a loft above, and a door opened onto what he used as a bedroom. Elizabeth stood uncertainly just inside the threshold, as if afraid to contaminate the space with her presence. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing to one of the rough-hewn chairs at the table. "You look ready to drop," while she lowered herself carefully onto the chair. He busied himself at the stove. The movements were automatic, building up the fire, setting water to boil, slicing bread from the loaf he'd baked 2 days prior. He found some salt pork and beans, simple fare but filling. As he worked, he talked, keeping his voice low and steady. "Been running this place alone for 3 years now. Started with just 20 head of cattle and a deed to land nobody else wanted. Dry years have been hard. Lost a third of my herd last summer to drought. But the land's honest. You work it fair. It gives back what it can." "Why live out here alone?" Elizabeth asked, her voice still hoarse. "Don't you have family?" "No family left," Jacob replied, stirring the beans. "Had a brother, but he died at Antietam. Parents gone before that. Figured I'd make my own way, build something from nothing. The isolation suits me fine most days." He set a plate before her. Beans, salt pork, bread with a precious bit of butter. Her hands shook as she picked up the fork, and he pretended not to notice how she had to force herself to eat slowly, with dignity, when hunger probably demanded she wolf it down. "Tell me about your situation," he said after she'd eaten enough to take the edge off. "I know some from the talk in town, but I'd rather hear truth than gossip." Elizabeth set down her fork, fingers worrying at the torn fabric of her dress. "My husband, Samuel Morrison, came out from Baltimore 2 years ago. He had such dreams, talked about making a fortune in mining, about building something grand in the West." Her voice turned bitter. "I was fool enough to believe him." "Following dreams doesn't make you a fool," Jacob said quietly. "It does when you're blind to what's right in front of you." She took a shuddering breath. "Samuel had a weakness for cards and whiskey. He hit it well at first, but out here, with the saloons and the mining camps, he lost everything. The homestead, our savings, even borrowed against future earnings that would never come. When the mine shaft collapsed last winter, you were left holding his debts." Jacob finished. She nodded. "The creditors came calling before I'd even buried him. The house went first, then everything in it. I tried to find work, but—" She gestured helplessly. "A widow with no skills but keeping house and reading books. The only offers I got were unsuitable. Jacob could imagine what kind of offers those had been. Cedar Ridge had its share of establishments that preyed on desperate women. So the town decided you were a burden, he said, anger creeping into his voice despite himself. Mayor Pickens called it a creative solution, Elizabeth said with a hollow laugh. Rather than run me out directly, they'd let someone else take responsibility. If no one did, she shrugged. Problem solved either way. Bastards, Jacob muttered, then caught himself. Pardon my language. I've heard worse, she said dryly. These past months have been quite educational. They sat in silence for a moment. The only sound, the pop of wood in the stove. Finally, Jacob spoke again. Here's how I see it. I need help around here, cooking, tending the vegetable garden, mending, keeping house. Things I don't have time for when I'm working cattle. You need a place to stay and honest work. Seems we might help each other. Elizabeth studied him warily. And what else would you expect? Men don't generally offer charity without expecting payment. Jacob met her gaze steadily. I'm offering you a job. Mrs. Morrison. Fair wages, room, board, and a small salary I can afford. You work for me, not anything else. That door there leads to my room. You'll sleep up in the loft. There's a bolt on the trap door you can throw from inside if it makes you feel safer. What happened to you in town was wrong, and I won't add to it. Tears welled in her eyes again. Why should I trust you? No reason you should, Jacob admitted. Trust is earned, not given. All I can say is I've got no use for men who mistreat women, and I sleep sound at night because I keep my word. You want to leave come morning. I'll take you wherever you want to go, but for tonight, you're safe here. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Sullivan, I accept your offer. Jacob, he corrected. Mr. Sullivan was my father, and he was a harder man than I ever want to be. The ghost of a smile flickered across her face, the first he'd seen. Then you must call me Elizabeth, Mrs. Morrison belongs to a life that no longer exists. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob showed Elizabeth around the small ranch. The garden plot behind the house had gone mostly to weeds. Never could get the hang of growing vegetables, he admitted sheepishly. The chicken coop stood empty. Coyotes got the last of them a month back. But there was potential here, space for growth and improvement. That night, after Elizabeth had climbed to the loft and he'd heard the bolt slide home, Jacob sat by the dying fire and wondered what tomorrow would bring. He'd acted on instinct in town, unable to stand by while injustice was done. Now he had to live with the consequences, a traumatized woman under his roof, the enmity of the town, and complications he couldn't yet foresee. But when he remembered Elizabeth kneeling in chains, tears on her face but dignity in her eyes, he knew he'd make the same choice again. Some things a man had to do to live with himself, practical or not. The prairie wind howled around the cabin, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang their lonely song to the rising moon. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, Elizabeth Morrison was safe, fed, and sheltered. It was a start. The first weeks passed in careful routine, each day building upon the last like stones in a wall. Elizabeth proved herself a capable worker, approaching each task with quiet determination. She rose before dawn to start the coffee and prepare breakfast, her movements gradually losing the hesitant quality they'd had those first days. The kitchen, which had been purely functional under Jacob's bachelor care, began to show small touches of domesticity. A jar of wildflowers on the table, dishes arranged neatly on the shelf he'd built, the windows actually cleaned until they sparkled in the morning light. Jacob watched these changes with a mixture of appreciation and something else he couldn't quite name. The ranch house felt different with her presence, warmer somehow, more like a home than just a place to sleep between working days. He'd catch himself looking forward to the evening meal, to the quiet conversation that had begun to flow more naturally between them as she grew less wary. "You've done wonders with that garden," he commented one evening. surveying the neat rows of vegetables that had replaced the weed-choked plot. Never thought anything useful would grow in that dirt. Elizabeth straightened from where she'd been tending the young tomato plants, a smudge of soil on her cheek. The soil's better than you think. It just needed proper attention and care. She paused, then added softly, "Most things respond well to that." There was something in her voice that made him think she wasn't just talking about vegetables. These past weeks had put color back in her cheeks and steadiness in her hands. But he still caught her sometimes staring off toward town with a haunted expression, as if waiting for this respite to be snatched away. The transformation wasn't just in the garden. Elizabeth had mended his shirts with tiny, precise stitches, organized the chaos of his supplies, and somehow made meals that turned his basic provisions into something worth savoring. The chicken coop, rebuilt and reinforced, now housed a small flock she'd convinced him to purchase on his last trip for supplies, a trip she hadn't accompanied him on, despite his offer. "I'm not ready," she'd said simply. "Not yet." He understood. The memory of chains and public humiliation didn't fade quickly, so he'd gone alone, enduring the cold stares and whispered comments of the townspeople who clearly thought him a fool. Let them think what they wanted. The ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't in years. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Jacob returned from checking the herd to find Elizabeth on the porch, staring at something in her hands. As he drew closer, he saw it was a letter, the paper worn as if it had been read many times. "From home?" he asked gently, settling onto the step beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "My sister in Baltimore," she replied. "It's old, from before. Everything." She writes about her children, her husband's promotion at the bank, their new house on Elm Street. Her voice caught. "A lifetime ago. That could have been me. Do you want to write back? I could post a letter next time I'm in town." Elizabeth shook her head. "What would I say?" "Dear Margaret, I'm not dead as you probably assumed. Just working as a housekeeper in Texas after being chained in the town square like a stray dog." Bitterness crept into her tone. "Some shames are better left unspoken. Surviving isn't shameful," Jacob said firmly. "What was done to you, that's the shame, and it belongs to them that did it, not to you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw surprise in her eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and he stood, offering her his hand. "Storm's coming. We'd best get inside." She accepted his help up, and for a moment they stood close, her hand still in his. Something passed between them, not quite attraction, not yet, but an acknowledgement of possibility. Then lightning flickered across the darkening sky, and the moment broke. That night, the storm struck with typical prairie fury. Rain hammered the roof, and wind howled through every small gap in the logs. Jacob lay awake, listening to the tempest and the occasional creak from the loft above. He knew Elizabeth must be frightened. These sudden violent storms still unsettled him, and he'd lived through dozens. A particularly fierce gust shook the whole house, and he heard a small cry from above. Before he could second-guess himself, he was at the foot of the ladder. "Elizabeth, you all right up there?" A pause, then her voice, trying to sound steady. "Yes, I'm fine." Another crash of thunder, another involuntary gasp from the loft. Jacob made a decision. "I'm going to sit down here by the fire," he called up. "Sometimes it helps not to be alone when the storm's bad. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." For long minutes, there was only the sound of rain. Then he heard the bolt slide back, and she descended the ladder, wrapped in the quilt from her bed. Her face was pale in the firelight, and he could see she'd been crying. "Samuel died in a storm," she said quietly, settling into the chair across from him. Not the mind collapse that came later. He was caught in a flash flood coming back from the gaming tables. They found him the next morning. She pulled the quilt tighter. "I used to love storms. Now they remind me that everything can be swept away in an instant." Jacob added another log to the fire, choosing his words carefully. "Lost my brother in a storm too. in a way, not the storm itself, but the mud and the rain at Antietam. He wrote that it never stopped raining, that the ground turned to bloody soup. He stared into the flames. Took me a long time to appreciate rain again after that. But the land needs storms, violent as they are. They bring life along with destruction. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside. Gradually, Elizabeth's rigid posture relaxed. When her eyes began to droop, Jacob quietly suggested she take his bed for the rest of the night. He'd be fine in the chair. Too tired to protest, she accepted, disappearing into his room with a murmured thanks. Jacob stayed by the fire, keeping watch as the storm slowly exhausted itself. He thought about the trust she'd shown, coming down from her safe perch, sharing her grief. It was progress, slow but real, like the garden responding to care, like the ranch flourishing under her attention. Something was growing between them, fragile yet, but with potential for strength. Dawn came gray and wet, the storm leaving puddles in the yard and a fresh, clean scent in the air. Jacob was starting coffee when Elizabeth emerged from his room, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry for being so foolish last night." "Nothing foolish about it," he interrupted gently. "We all need somebody sometimes. No shame in that either." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll start breakfast." As she moved about the kitchen with renewed purpose, Jacob noticed something different. The haunted look that usually shadowed her eyes had lightened, not gone, but diminished. She hummed softly as she worked, the first time he'd heard her do so. Later that morning, as he prepared to ride out to check for storm damage, she stopped him at the door. "Jacob?" She rarely used his given name, and it caught his attention. "Thank you for last night, for everything. I know I haven't been easy to have around." "You've been exactly what this place needed," he replied honestly. "What I needed too, though I didn't know it. Ranch hasn't felt this much like home since, well, maybe ever." Color rose in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "It's starting to feel like home to me too. I wanted you to know that." He touched the brim of his hat, not trusting himself to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat, and headed out to work. But her words stayed with him through the morning, warming him more than the sun that finally broke through the clouds. That evening, he returned to find she'd moved a few of her things down from the loft. Just small items, but their presence in the main room spoke volumes. She'd made a choice to stop hiding, to claim her place in this shared space they were creating together. "Thought I might start taking my evening tea down here," she said casually, not quite meeting his eyes. "If that's all right." "More than all right," Jacob assured her. As they sat by the fire that night, each reading by lamplight, he with a week-old newspaper, she with a book of poetry she'd salvaged from her former life, Jacob felt a contentment he hadn't known in years. The ranch was still modest, the work still hard, and the future uncertain. But for now, in this moment, they had built something good from the ashes of tragedy. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under stars washed clean by the storm. Inside, the fire crackled peacefully, and two wounded souls continued the slow work of healing, together. The peace of their growing domesticity was shattered on a blazing afternoon in late July. Jacob had just returned from moving the herd to fresh grazing when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon, too large for a single rider, too purposeful to be drifters. His hand instinctively checked the colt at his hip as he guided his horse toward the house. Elizabeth was in the garden, her sunbonnet shading her face as she worked among the thriving vegetables. She looked up at his approach, and he saw the moment she noticed his tension. Without a word, she stood and moved toward the house, understanding danger even before he spoke. "Riders coming," he said tersely. "Maybe 6 or 7. Get inside." Through the kitchen window, they watched the group approach. Jacob recognized several faces from town. Walt Dixon riding lead, his scarred face set in hard lines. Beside him rode Dixon's younger brother Clay, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as unpredictable. The others were hired hands and drinking companions, the sort who'd do anything for whiskey money. "Stay inside," Jacob ordered. checking his rifle before stepping onto the porch. The riders pulled up just outside his fence line, horses stamping and blowing in the heat. Dixon leaned forward in his saddle, that ugly scar pulling his smile into something grotesque. "Afternoon, Sullivan." He drawled, "Fine day for settling debts." "No debts here to settle." Jacob replied evenly, "You've got no business on my land, Dixon." "See, that's where you're wrong." Dixon spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "That woman in there owes me $300. Her worthless husband borrowed it with promises of striking it rich. Well, he struck nothing but rock, and now the debt passes to her. A man's debts die with him." Jacob said, "You know that as well as I do." Clay Dixon laughed. An unpleasant sound. "Not when there's property to claim. And the widow there, well, she's property now, ain't she? You took her from the town square, but that don't make her yours free and clear." Jacob felt cold fury rise in his chest. "Mrs. Morrison is a free woman and an employee of this ranch. She owes you nothing." "Employee?" Dixon mocked. "That what you're calling it? We all know what kind of work a woman like that does." The rifle was in Jacob's hands before he consciously decided to raise it. "Choose your next words careful like. Dixon, they might be your last." The tension stretched taut as fence wire. Several of the riders shifted nervously, hands drifting toward their guns. Then the cabin door opened, and Elizabeth stepped out. "No," Jacob said sharply, but she kept coming, moving to stand beside him on the porch. "Mr. Dixon," she said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. "My husband's debts were settled when his creditors took our home and everything in it. You were paid in land and goods worth twice what he borrowed. Paper says 300 cash money." Dixon growled. "Land weren't worth spit without someone to work it." "Then your quarrel was with Samuel, not with me." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I signed no papers, made no promises. In the eyes of the law." "The law?" Clay Dixon interrupted with a harsh laugh. "You think the law cares about some used-up widow? Judge Hartley's a drinking buddy of ours. He'll see things our way right quick." "Then why haven't you taken it to court?" Jacob challenged. "Why come here with armed men if the law's on your side?" Walt Dixon's face darkened. "Because I'm tired of waiting. Because it sticks in my craw seeing her live comfortable while I'm out $300. And because I can." He swung down from his horse, and Jacob chambered around in the rifle. The sound carried clearly in the still air. "That's far enough," Jacob warned. "You really want to die for some woman you barely know?" Dixon asked. "She ain't worth it. Sullivan, just another piece of frontier trash that—" The shot was impossibly loud in the afternoon quiet. Dixon's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. He froze, face draining of color. "Next one's lower," Jacob said calmly. "Get off my land, now." For a moment, violence trembled on the edge of erupting. Hands hovered over gun butts. Horses danced nervously. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Dixon, you're a businessman. Let me make you a business proposition." She descended the porch steps, ignoring Jacob's warning hiss. "Give me 6 months. I'll work and save every penny I can. Whatever I can pay you then. You'll take as full settlement of any claim you imagine you have." "Elizabeth, no," Jacob protested. But she continued as if he hadn't spoken. 6 months, she repeated. "If you're truly interested in recovering money rather than simply tormenting a widow, it's a fair offer." Dixon retrieved his hat, fingering the bullet hole with a scowl. 3 months, he countered. "And if you can't pay, you come work it off however I see fit. 6 months, and if I can't pay, I'll leave the territory entirely." Elizabeth said, "You'll never have to see me again, and you can tell everyone you drove me out. That should satisfy your pride." The scar on Dixon's face twisted as he considered. Pride warred with greed in his expression, and greed won. 4 months, first day of December. You pay what you can or you're gone, and Sullivan here doesn't interfere." "Agreed," Elizabeth said before Jacob could object. Dixon remounted, gathering his men with a gesture. 4 months. Widow. Don't think I'll forget. He looked at Jacob with naked hatred. And you. This ain't over between us. Man can't watch his back every minute. They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats, leaving Jacob and Elizabeth standing in the barnyard. As soon as they were out of sight, Elizabeth's knees buckled. Jacob caught her before she fell, supporting her back to the house. Why? He demanded, once she was seated at the kitchen table. Why make a deal with that snake? Because he would have killed you, she said simply. Or you would have killed him, and they'd hang you for it. Either way, I'd have been the cause of a good man's death. She met his eyes, her own bright with unshed tears. I've caused enough harm. I won't have your blood on my conscience, too. It's not your fault. None of it, Jacob said fiercely. And I won't let you sacrifice yourself to that bastard's greed. 4 months is a long time, Elizabeth said with forced lightness. Perhaps something will change. Dixon might drink himself to death or get kicked by a horse. Or maybe I really can save enough to satisfy him. They both knew it was impossible. Even if she saved every cent of the modest wage he paid her, it wouldn't come close to $300. Jacob's mind raced, calculating his own resources. If he sold some cattle, maybe took out a loan. No, Elizabeth said, reading his thoughts. You won't ruin yourself for my sake. Promise me, Jacob. Whatever happens, you won't destroy what you've built here trying to save me from my own mistakes. Marrying a man who lied to you wasn't a mistake, Jacob argued. It was trust betrayed, and I won't stand by while. She placed her hand over his on the table, the first time she'd voluntarily touched him since that night in the storm. Promise me, she repeated softly. Please. The warmth of her fingers against his scrambled his thoughts. When had she become so vital to him? When had the thought of losing her become unbearable? I can't promise that, he said roughly. I won't. She withdrew her hand, wrapping her arms around herself. Then I'll have to find another way. Perhaps if I went to the territorial governor or found a lawyer who'd listen. We'll find a way together, Jacob insisted. But right now, you need rest. The garden can wait. That evening, they ate in troubled silence. The easy companionship they'd built seemed fractured by the afternoon's violence and the deadline hanging over them. Jacob cleaned his guns while Elizabeth mended a shirt with mechanical precision, both lost in dark thoughts. I should leave now, she said suddenly. Tonight, before this gets worse. Running won't solve anything. Dixon would just hunt you down, and then you'd be alone as well as in danger. Jacob set aside the rifle he'd been cleaning. We have 4 months. A lot can happen in 4 months. Yes, Elizabeth agreed bleakly. A lot of people can get hurt in 4 months. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild cries echoing across the darkening prairie. Jacob thought about the men who'd threatened them today, about the violence that simmered just beneath the surface of frontier civility. He'd built this ranch with his own hands, carved out a small piece of peace in a harsh land. Now that peace was shattered, and the woman sitting across from him, the woman who'd brought such unexpected warmth to his life, blamed herself for it. Elizabeth, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he felt, that her presence was worth any danger, that he'd faced down a dozen Walt Dixons to keep her safe, that somewhere between that morning in the town square and this evening by lamplight, she'd become essential to him. She looked up, and in her eyes he saw his own confusion reflected. They were balanced on the edge of something neither had expected, neither had sought, but both recognized. We'll face whatever comes, he said finally. Together. She nodded slowly, and though worry still creased her brow, something in her posture eased. Together. It wasn't a solution, wasn't even really a plan, but for now, in the circle of lamplight while darkness pressed against the windows, it was enough. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains with a fury that old-timers said they hadn't seen in decades. The first blizzard struck in late October, catching everyone off guard. Jacob had been moving the herd to winter pasture when the storm hit, and he barely made it back to the ranch house. ice coating his beard and his horse stumbling with exhaustion. Elizabeth met him at the door, her face pale with worry. She'd kept the fire blazing and had hot coffee ready, her hands steady as she helped him out of his frozen coat. Neither spoke of the deadline looming over them, now less than 6 weeks away, but it colored every interaction, every quiet moment. The brutal weather continued through November, snow piling in drifts against the cabin walls, temperatures plummeting until even the hardy longhorns huddled together for warmth. Jacob lost 3 head to the cold, finding them frozen in the far pasture, and each loss was a blow to his already strained finances. "We're not going to make it through winter at this rate," he said one evening, staring at his ledger by lamplight. Feed costs had doubled with the early snow, and he'd had to buy supplies on credit in town, credit that was getting harder to come by as word of his conflict with Dixon spread. Elizabeth looked up from her sewing. She'd been taking in mending from the few neighbors willing to brave both the weather and association with her, working by candlelight until her eyes burned. The coins she earned were pitifully few, but she hoarded each one in a tin box beneath her bed. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad enough." Jacob rubbed his face, exhaustion etched in every line. "If I sell the breeding stock, we might scrape through. But that's the future of the ranch gone. No." Her voice was firm. "You won't destroy everything you've built. Not for me." "It's not just for you anymore," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. They stared at each other across the lamp-lit table. These past months had woven their lives together in ways neither had expected. The careful distance they'd maintained at first had gradually dissolved, replaced by something deeper: shared meals, quiet evenings, the comfortable rhythm of 2 people learning to move in harmony. "Jacob," Elizabeth began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I know what you're going to say, that you'll leave before you let me ruin myself. But you're not thinking clear." He leaned forward, intense. "Where would you go in this weather? How would you survive? Dixon's made sure everyone in 3 counties knows about the debt. No one will hire you, shelter you. It's December in 5 days. Elizabeth, this cold would kill you before Dixon ever got the chance." She looked away, but not before he saw the sheen of tears in her eyes. "Then what do we do?" "We survive," Jacob said simply. "Day by day, we survive." The blizzard that struck 2 nights later was the worst yet. Wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontal past the windows. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside walls, and they had to bring the chickens into the kitchen to keep them from freezing. Jacob had been out checking the herd when the storm intensified. Elizabeth waited, pacing between window and door, fear growing with each passing hour. When he finally stumbled through the door, he was half frozen, barely conscious. She managed to get him to the fire, stripping off his ice-crusted clothes with desperate efficiency. "So cold," he mumbled, shivering violently. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She grabbed every blanket in the house, wrapping them both as she held him close, sharing her body heat. Propriety meant nothing against the very real danger of losing him to the cold. Through the night she held him, feeding the fire, warming stones to tuck against his feet, talking to keep him conscious. She told him about her childhood in Baltimore, about the books she'd loved, the dreams she'd had before Samuel's promises led her west. And when he finally stopped shivering, when color returned to his face, she found herself still holding him, unwilling to let go. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough. One hand came up to touch her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Don't cry. I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When you didn't come back, I thought—" "I'm too stubborn to die," he said, attempting levity. But his hand remained on her cheek, and something shifted in the air between them. "I've been thinking," he continued slowly, "about Dixon, about the debt. There might be a way. Jacob, hear me out." He struggled to sit up, keeping one blanket wrapped around them both. "What if Dixon couldn't collect because you were no longer a widow? What if you were married again? Elizabeth went very still. Are you proposing out of pity? No. His voice was fierce. I'm proposing because these months with you have been the best of my life. Because this house feels empty when you're not in it. Because the thought of you leaving tears me apart. He paused, vulnerability replacing intensity. But also because it might save you. A husband's protection still means something. Even out here, Dixon would have to challenge me directly, and he's too much a coward for that. You'd saddle yourself with a wife you never wanted, just to spite Walt Dixon? Elizabeth pulled away slightly. That's no basis for a marriage. Woman, you're not listening, Jacob said with fond exasperation. I'm saying I want you for my wife. Dixon or no Dixon, debt or no debt. I'm saying I love you, though I've done a poor job showing it. The wind howled around the cabin, but inside, there was sudden stillness. Elizabeth searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or mere obligation. What she found instead made her breath catch. I'm still the woman who was chained in the town square, she said softly. Still the widow who brought trouble to your door. I have nothing to offer but myself, and that's been deemed worthless by better judges than you. Then they're fools, Jacob said simply. You've brought life to this place. Elizabeth, beauty and warmth and a reason to be better than I was. If that's worthless, then nothing in this world has value. She was crying openly now, months of fear and shame and growing hope spilling over. I love you too, she whispered. God help me, I fought against it, but I love you too. He kissed her then, gentle and sure, a promise made while winter raged outside. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling with more than cold. Is that a yes? Jacob asked, a smile playing at his lips. Yes, Elizabeth said, laughing through her tears. Yes, you wonderful, stubborn fool. They were married 3 days later, the circuit preacher performing a simple ceremony in the ranch house. Only their nearest neighbors, the Andersons, served as witnesses, a brave act given the social pressure from town. Elizabeth wore her best dress, carefully mended, and Jacob had trimmed his beard and donned his Sunday shirt. It wasn't the wedding either might have imagined in younger days, but it was real and true, and theirs. That night, as Elizabeth lay in his arms, no longer in the loft but in the bed they now shared as husband and wife, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year. Safety. Not just physical protection, but the deeper security of being truly known and still chosen. What happens when Dixon comes? She asked in the darkness. We face him together, Jacob replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. As family now. Let him try to break that. Outside, the wind had finally died, leaving the world wrapped in silent white. The deadline was 2 days away, but for now, in the warmth of their bed while snow covered the harsh edges of the world, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe that love might be enough to conquer even the cruelest twists of fate. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Jacob asked drowsily. For seeing me, she said. Not the fallen woman, not the burden, not the widow in chains. Just me. His arms tightened around her. That's all I've ever seen, he murmured. From that first moment in the square. Just you, Elizabeth, just you. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their small sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, Dixon's threats, winter's hardships, the judgment of a harsh world. But tonight, they had each other, and that was wealth beyond measure. Spring arrived reluctantly, fighting winter's grip with alternating days of warmth and sudden freezes. The snow melted into mud, turning the ranch yard into a quagmire and making travel treacherous. It was on such a morning in early April that Jacob spotted riders approaching, not the hostile charge they'd feared, but an official procession led by Judge Hartley himself. Elizabeth, Jacob called quietly, and she appeared at his shoulder, flour still dusting her hands from the morning's baking. Her face paled at the sight of the judge's carriage. So it begins, she murmured. But Judge Hartley's first words surprised them. Mister, Sullivan. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, tipping his hat with apparent courtesy. I'm here on official business regarding a legal complaint filed by Mr. Walt Dixon. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Elizabeth touched his arm. What complaint would that be, Judge? She asked calmly. Theft, ma'am, Mr. Dixon alleges that certain valuable items belonging to your late first husband, items pledged against his debts, were concealed and removed from the property before creditors could claim them. That's a lie, Elizabeth said flatly. Everything of value was taken. They left me with nothing but the clothes on my back. Perhaps we could discuss this inside, the judge suggested, his eyes scanning the horizon nervously. Despite his official capacity, he seemed uncomfortable being so far from town. Once seated at their table, Judge Hartley produced a document. Mr. Dixon claimed specifically that a gold pocket watch, a set of silver mining certificates, and a leather journal containing claim locations were hidden. He has witnesses. Bought witnesses, Jacob growled. The judge's expression suggested he didn't entirely disagree. Be that as it may, there must be a formal inquiry, a trial, to be held 2 weeks hence. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I must warn you, Mrs. Sullivan, that if found guilty, the penalty could be severe. The territorial prison takes a dim view of debt-related theft. After the judge departed, Elizabeth sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. They mean to destroy us one way or another, she said, if not through debt, then through false charges. We'll fight it, Jacob said firmly. Get you a proper lawyer. With what money? And who would take the case? Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. Dixon owns half the town through fear or debt. No one will stand against him. But Jacob was already reaching for his coat. Maybe not in Cedar Ridge, but there's other towns, other lawyers. I'll ride to Fort Sumter, see if— No, Elizabeth stood, squaring her shoulders. I won't run from this, and I won't have you begging help from strangers on my account. A strange calm settled over her features. I have 2 weeks, time enough to prepare my own defense. The following days saw Elizabeth transform into someone Jacob hardly recognized. She wrote letters to every merchant who dealt with her husband, requesting sworn statements about what was taken. She documented every item sold to satisfy creditors, creating a meticulous paper trail. Most surprisingly, she began visiting neighbors, even those who'd shunned her before. What are you doing? Jacob asked one evening, finding her at the table surrounded by papers and ink. Building truth, she replied. Mrs. Anderson remembers seeing Dixon's men cart away Samuel's watch, the same one he now claims I hid. Tom Santos bought our mining certificates at public auction. He's willing to testify to that. She looked up, a fierce light in her eyes. Dixon thinks I'm still the frightened widow he can bully. He's about to learn otherwise. As the trial date approached, something unexpected began happening. People who'd avoided them for months started stopping by the ranch. A few brought small offerings, preserved food, mended harnesses, little gestures of support. Martha Anderson was the most vocal, her righteous indignation aroused. That Dixon's gone too far this time, she declared, accepting a cup of tea from Elizabeth. Wasn't enough to humiliate you in the square, now he's got to pursue you with lies? Well, some of us have had enough. My Herbert says half the town's in debt to Dixon one way or another, all afraid to speak up, but maybe it's time that changed. The morning of the trial dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth dressed carefully in her best dress, the one she'd married Jacob in, and pinned her hair in a severe style that emphasized her dignity. Jacob watched her preparations with a mixture of pride and fear. Whatever happens, he began. Whatever happens, we face it together, she finished, taking his hand. You taught me that. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was packed beyond capacity. Citizens drawn by the promise of drama and the rare spectacle of someone challenging Walt Dixon. The man himself sat in the front row, scarred face twisted in a confident smirk. Beside him sat his purchased witnesses, men whose shifting eyes and nervous fidgets spoke volumes about their credibility. Judge Hartley called the proceedings to order, and the prosecutor, a thin man named Cornelius Webb, who owed Dixon money, began presenting the case. The witnesses testified as expected, claiming to have seen Elizabeth hiding valuables, speaking of secret late-night meetings where she supposedly conspired to defraud creditors. Then it was Elizabeth's turn. She rose gracefully, approaching the witness chair with steady steps. As she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, Jacob saw Dixon's smirk begin to falter. She presented her evidence methodically: receipts, sworn statements, a detailed inventory signed by the sheriff himself when the property was seized. But more powerful than papers was her presence itself, the quiet dignity with which she refuted each lie. "Mr. Dixon speaks of a gold watch," she said, producing a yellowed photograph. "This watch, visible here in our wedding portrait, the same watch purchased by Mr. Garrett at public auction for $12. Mr. Garrett, would you please confirm this?" The blacksmith stood reluctantly. He owed Dixon money too, but faced with direct questioning and Elizabeth's steady gaze, he couldn't lie. "Aye, that's true. I bought it fair and square." One by one, Elizabeth dismantled the case against her. The mining certificates Tom Santos confirmed purchasing. The leather journal one of Dixon's own men admitted to burning, thinking it worthless. The crowd began to murmur, sentiment shifting palpably. It was then that Dixon erupted from his seat. "This is ridiculous. Everyone knows what she is, a parasite who drove her husband to ruin and now hides behind Sullivan's protection." "Mr. Dixon, you're out of order," Judge Hartley warned. But Dixon was beyond caring. "You think marrying him changes what you are?" he snarled at Elizabeth. "You're still the woman we put in chains, still the debt that needs paying, and one way or another, I'll collect." The threat hung in the air, naked and ugly. Elizabeth stood slowly, turning to face her tormentor. "Yes," she said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. "I am the woman you chained in the square, the widow you tried to break with cruelty and shame. But I am also the woman who survived it, who found love and honest work, and a new life despite your best efforts to destroy me." She paused, lifting her chin. "I owe you nothing, Mr. Dixon. Not money, not shame, not fear, nothing." The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Martha Anderson, on her feet, applauding with fierce determination. Others joined her, slowly at first, then in a wave of support that clearly shocked both Dixon and Judge Hartley. The judge gabbled for order, but the damage to Dixon's case was done. After a brief recess, Hartley returned with his verdict: not guilty on all charges, with a stern warning to Dixon about filing false accusations. As the crowd dispersed, many stopping to offer Elizabeth congratulations or apologies for past behavior, Dixon pushed through to confront them one last time. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won. You'll do nothing." A new voice interrupted. Sheriff Harlan stepped between them, his weathered face stern. "I've been doing some investigating of my own. Dixon, seems several of those debts you've been collecting on were already paid to Morrison before he died. Forged papers, false claims, that's prison time." Dixon's face went white. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not yet," Harlan admitted. "But I'll be watching. One more move against the Sullivans, and I'll turn over every rock until I find what's crawling underneath." He touched his hat to Elizabeth. "Ma'am, my apologies for not seeing the truth sooner." As they rode home through the spring afternoon, Elizabeth leaned against Jacob's solid warmth, exhaustion finally claiming her. "It's really over," she murmured. "That part is," Jacob agreed. "But the rest, our life together, that's just beginning." She smiled, thinking of the garden waiting to be planted, the ranch to be tended, the future stretching before them no longer shadowed by fear. "Just beginning," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew small in the distance, and ahead, the Double S Ranch waited in the golden light of approaching evening home, sanctuary, and promise of all the years to come. The weeks following the trial brought a peace to the Double S Ranch that neither Jacob nor Elizabeth had dared hope for. Spring bloomed in earnest, painting the prairie with wildflowers, purple lupines, golden black-eyed Susans, and delicate prairie roses that Elizabeth transplanted carefully around the house. The garden she'd started the previous year flourished under her care, expanded now with herbs and flowers alongside the practical vegetables. "Never thought I'd see the day this place looked like a proper home," Jacob commented one evening, surveying the transformed yard. New curtains graced the windows. A rocking chair sat on the porch he'd finally finished building, and the fence bore a fresh coat of whitewash. Elizabeth smiled, dirt under her fingernails from planting. It was always a proper home. It just needed some tending to bloom. She paused, then added softly, "Like us." The transformation wasn't just physical. Word of Elizabeth's courage at the trial had spread throughout the territory, shifting public opinion in ways that still surprised them. Women who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to chat at the general store. Men who'd participated in her humiliation that awful day in the square now tipped their hats respectfully, some even mumbling apologies. Mrs. Sullivan, Mayor Pickens had said just last week, hat literally in hand, "I owe you an apology. What we did, what I allowed. It was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive us." Elizabeth had studied him for a long moment before responding. "Forgiveness is earned through changed behavior. Mayor, see that no other woman suffers what I did, and we'll call it square." But the most significant change came in the form of a letter on a warm June morning. Elizabeth's hands shook as she recognized the handwriting. "It's from Margaret," she breathed. "My sister." Jacob moved behind her chair, a supportive presence as she broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the lines, tears starting to flow halfway through. "She heard about the trial. Someone sent her a newspaper clipping." Elizabeth's voice broke. She says she's proud of me, that Mother and Father would have been proud too, seeing me stand up for myself." She turned to Jacob, wonder in her eyes. "She wants to visit, to meet you." "Then she's welcome," Jacob said simply. "Family is always welcome." Margaret arrived 3 weeks later on the stage from Fort Worth, a properly dressed Eastern lady who looked somewhat out of place against the rough frontier backdrop. But any awkwardness dissolved when the sisters embraced, years of separation melting away in shared tears. "Oh, Lizzie," Margaret murmured, using the childhood nickname. "When we heard about Samuel's death, and then nothing for so long, we feared the worst. For a time, the worst nearly found me," Elizabeth admitted. "But then Jacob did instead." Watching the sisters reconnect over the following days, Jacob felt a deep satisfaction. Elizabeth glowed with happiness, showing Margaret around the ranch, introducing her to their life with pride rather than apology. The evening conversation stretched long into the night, filled with shared memories and plans for renewed connection. "Your husband is a good man," Margaret told Elizabeth one afternoon as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "Jacob was visible in the distance, working with a young horse. The way he looks at you, that's real love." "Lizzie." "I know," Elizabeth said softly. "He gave me back myself when I thought I was lost forever. How do you repay something like that?" "By living well," Margaret replied. "By being happy, by building the life you deserve together." The day before Margaret's departure, she pulled Jacob aside. "I brought something," she said, producing a small leather pouch. "Lizzie's portion of our parents' estate. It's not much, they were never wealthy, but it's rightfully hers." Jacob started to protest, but Margaret pressed the pouch into his hands. "For the ranch," she insisted. "For your future together. Consider it a very belated wedding gift." Inside was nearly $400, enough to pay off Jacob's credit at the store, purchase new breeding stock, and still have funds for improvements. When he tried to thank her, Margaret simply smiled. "You gave my sister back her life," she said. "Money seems a small thing in comparison." As summer reached its peak, the Double S Ranch thrived as never before. The cattle grew fat on good grass. The garden produced abundantly, and the house rang with something that had been absent for years: laughter. Elizabeth had taken to singing while she worked, old songs from her childhood that made Jacob pause in his labors just to listen. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elizabeth took Jacob's hand. "I've been thinking about what you said that night in the storm," she said, "about taking you from that town square being the moment everything changed." "It was," Jacob confirmed, threading his fingers through hers. "You said my tears undid you." She turned to face him fully. "But don't you see? You undid me too, all the walls I'd built, all the armor I'd wrapped around my heart. You saw past what they'd tried to make me and found who I really was. Who you always were." Jacob corrected gently. "I just gave you space to remember." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the deepening sky. In the distance, a wolf howled. Not threatening now, just part of the wild symphony of their land. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, but it no longer seemed harsh or forbidding. It was simply home. "I got a letter from Sheriff Harlan today," Jacob mentioned casually. "Dixon's left the territory. Seems his creditors finally caught up with him, and he lit out for California rather than face his own debts." Elizabeth absorbed this news with a small nod. "I hope he finds redemption there," she said, surprising Jacob. "Carrying that much hatred must be its own prison. You can forgive him? After everything?" "Forgive?" Elizabeth considered. "Perhaps not yet, but I can release him. Let go of the anger. We have too much good in our lives now to waste time on old bitterness." As if to emphasize her point, she stood and held out her hand. "Come to bed, husband. Tomorrow we start cutting hay, and you'll need your strength." Jacob rose, pulling her close for a kiss that still, months after their wedding, made his heart race. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured against her lips. Inside their small house, lamplight pushed back the darkness, creating a warm circle of home. The bed Elizabeth had made comfortable with quilts and pillows waited. Their books sat on the shelf Jacob had built, and bunches of dried herbs from the garden scented the air. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it was theirs, built from trust and determination and love. As Elizabeth blew out the lamp and settled into Jacob's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, from chains in a town square to this moment of perfect contentment. The woman who'd knelt in humiliation, certain her life was over, could never have imagined this ending. No, not ending, beginning. "Jacob," she whispered in the darkness. "Thank you for seeing me that day, for being too stubborn to walk away." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you for being brave enough to trust me, to trust us." Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm. Two souls rested in the peace they'd fought so hard to find. The Double S Ranch slept under the vast Texas sky, a small oasis of love carved from an unforgiving land, testament to the power of compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. And in the morning, the sun would rise on their continued story, no longer one of survival, but of truly living together. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Elizabeth and Jacob's journey touched your heart as it did mine. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you in the bustling city or out in the countryside? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. Did you connect with Elizabeth's struggle? What did you think of Jacob's compassion? Let's discuss this tale of redemption and love in the comments section.